Okay, fantastic. Well, welcome everyone to today's session, and thanks for joining. I hope you've all got maybe some food there ready for you for the lunch and learn style session we're running through, or at the very least a coffee. Really excited to speak with what I can see here from those of you that I know. A room full of a lot of people with some great subject matter expertise in carbon accounting and sustainability more broadly, and then also with some people who may still be learning the ropes a little bit and have more to learn. So as a starting point, really want to encourage everyone to feel comfortable and welcome to ask any questions that they wish. So please don't be shy. Don't hesitate to take yourself off camera even and take yourself off mute and ask any questions that pop up. We will have a time for questions at the end, but you're more than welcome to ask as we go through. As a kickoff, just so you get a bit of a taste for what we are going to be focusing on today. Today is about an introduction to carbon accounting and sustainability 101. So really the idea here is to leave you all walking away from this quick session over lunch with an understanding of what your business or businesses that you work with would need to do in order to get their baseline emissions reports done, to have a firm understanding of their own impacts, and a clear understanding of their path to improvements and or any relevant certifications. So what we're going to cover off is the different methodologies in which are used to calculate businesses' emissions. We're also going to look into a technical background and also a summary of some of the key methodologies and frameworks. We're going to look also at sustainability a little bit more holistically, because we know that sustainability is not just carbon accounting. So we're going to dive a little bit into the ESG principles, environmental, social, and governance. And then we'll start to look at offsetting, the associated risks and benefits from offsetting, and also lastly, certification and mandatory reporting. So hope everyone's as excited as I am. Once again, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Lochie Burke, and I am one of the co-founders at NetNada. So without further ado, I'll share my screen and we can jump into things. Also, if you do have any questions while we go, please feel free to put them in the chat. I have my colleague Oscar here, who's happy to answer any of the questions you may have from the chat. So in an introduction to carbon accounting, it's very, very important for us to all understand a few key terms. Carbon neutrality and net zero are probably things that you hear quite a lot about, but it's very, very important to remember that they are different. What we see all the time is as businesses have their first step into, I'll just remove this, sorry, that's popped up. Okay, fantastic. What we see all the time is as businesses have their first step into their sustainability journey, they're often a little bit confused about the terminologies that they're following. We hear a lot about net zero, especially in government strategies for 2030 and 2050 targets. And we hear a lot about carbon neutrality, especially when companies are getting certifications. It's important to remember that carbon neutral is when a business has ideally reduced as much as possible from their footprint, but then they have purchased offsets and retired those offsets to make their footprint neutral. Where net zero is where you're actually not emitting any greenhouse gas emissions. So an example of a net zero business in today's day and age is very hard to find, because obviously there are certain technical barriers around actually being able to achieve net zero, but you in theory would have to be running on completely renewable energy with absolutely no additional emissions being generated by any of your suppliers or at any point of your operations. This, whether it's carbon neutrality or net zero, all falls under carbon accounting, which is our process where we quantify and track the greenhouse gas emissions produced, right? Both by the operations of your business directly within the four walls of your organization, and also indirectly by your supply chain. So I think the first really important note to know is it doesn't really matter what your business does. You are a part of the carbon accounting for your clients. Okay. And so it's really, really important for businesses of all shapes and sizes to now be able to understand what their emissions are so that they can also reduce them. The emissions are broken down into 3 scopes. Scope 1 are our direct emissions, which are from our owned and controlled sources. So fuel that's consumed in a business is an example of Scope 1 emissions, very direct there at the source. Scope 2 emissions, slightly less direct, indirect emissions from your purchased energy. So electricity and gas, the emissions are not often generated in the light bulb itself, but the grid and the power plant, where that energy comes from, of course, is creating those emissions, and you're purchasing them directly. Scope 3 is where, in my opinion, things get interesting, and I think this is an exciting thing to talk to you all about. And this is your supply chains. This is every single thing you consume, everything that's in your expenditure. It doesn't matter if it's your accountant or lawyer, or your waste management contractor, or the provider of a product or service that you consume, more than anything else. It all falls under your Scope 3. So today we're going to get a really good understanding of what falls into our Scope 1, 2, and 3, how we measure it, and the importance of Scope 3 emissions in particular. So, as I mentioned, you're a part of your client's Scope 3 emissions. And as you can see in this graph on the right here, it incorporates everything in a business. There is also upstream and downstream emissions. And it's really important to understand where you sit with your upstream and downstreams. Your upstream emissions are associated with the production of all of your business consumption, everything that you buy that's coming into your business. Your downstream emissions are associated with your services and the usage of your products. So this all falls under very, very important standards and frameworks. And the International Sustainability Standards Board in June last year made a really, really big move, where globally we saw the amalgamation of all standards under the ISSB. So what that means is, you may have previously heard of the CDP, the Climate Disclosures Program, or you may have previously heard of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, as you can see here, the TCFD, or Principles for Responsible Investment. These all now sit under the ISSB, which is the international governing body that is essentially set out how businesses need to be reporting and what they need to be covering off on in their sustainability reporting. Equally as interesting and impactful, especially for all the businesses here in the room, is Jim Chalmers and the Labor government came out last year in July, so quite quickly after the ISSB announcement, and released a consultation paper outlining Australia's response to these standards. And under that response, the government set out some mandates for businesses of certain sizes and activities to be mandated to report on their climate-related financial disclosures. So what we're seeing as soon as June this year, or July 1st, the new financial year, is all businesses with over $500 million revenue, all businesses or over 500 employees, or over $1 billion under management in assets, are all now required to report on their Scope 1, their Scope 2, and majority of their Scope 3 emissions. So what this means is, if you're working with these bigger companies, you would likely fall under that, or businesses that you work with, maybe your clients fall under that as well. So it's becoming a bit of a snowball effect, you could say, where these large organizations are now going to be mandating and forcing their clients to report, because they are being mandated and forced to report by the government. It's not too much different to what we've seen as far in the cyberspace for compliance with ISO 27701. It's not very different to what we've seen in a lot of industries with modern slavery assessments from a compliance perspective. The big takeaway here is your carbon accounting, and more broadly speaking, your ability to report on key sustainability metrics, is very much moving from a nice to have that we've seen previously and into a license to operate, which makes this much more of a compliance space and much less of a marketing goodwill, just sort of business ethics space, and it's much more now compliance and regulation. So with that in mind, I have spoken a lot about the environmental aspects of sustainability and the aspects around carbon accounting. But it's really, really important to acknowledge the fact that sustainability is not just carbon accounting, and sustainability is not just environmental. You have to truly achieve sustainability in society or in a business, you need to be addressing both the social and the environmental aspects. What is most commonly referenced to in this thought is donut economics, which, as you see here, we want to be operating in this, happy, green, ideal, soft, donutty space of this green area. This is where we see we're sustainably operating and living within both social foundations and ecological ceilings. So as you can see, from an environmental perspective, of course, we have to be addressing things like biodiversity, air pollution, climate change, ocean acidification. But at the same time, from a social perspective, we need to be addressing things like income and work, peace and justice, education, gender equality, social equity, and the list goes on. So from a business's perspective, yes, it's a fantastic first step if you're starting to consider your carbon accounting. And it's an even better first step if you're also starting to dive a little bit into your wider environmental reporting. But you also need to consider that you should be, and if you can't do it straight away, you should be at least planning to build that base and that framework and that foundation to address the social responsibilities of your business as well. So with that in mind, as I'm sure you all know, under the ESG framework, we have factors under our environment and our social, but also governance as well. NetNada does not help businesses with governance, but we strongly advise that you should be setting up the right structures internally to make sure that you have the correct policies and procedures in place, and managerial structures to make sure that you're adhering and exceeding your environmental and social requirements or goals. If you have a strong ESG framework, if it's transparent, you are a mile ahead of most other businesses. And I think the most important thing here to remember is the transparency piece, okay? So far, with all of these methodologies and frameworks, no one is expecting you to be perfect. And I think that's a common mistake that businesses sort of fall into the trap of and to be honest, get overly concerned about. It's more so about setting up a baseline and understanding maybe where you can improve. So in our environmental sustainability, it's really, really important to remember we're not only talking about carbon emissions. Of course, our greenhouse gas emissions include carbon and methane and other greenhouse gases, but we're also looking at your waste, your recycling, your water consumption, and how you ethically consume. Do you have processes in place for your procurement teams to decide on what you're purchasing and who you're purchasing it off? Okay, and are you also considering the environments in which your people are working under? So what we aim to help you with at NetNada and what we think you should set up as a process for yourself as well is identifying where the hotspots are in your environmental sustainability. So some businesses, right, you may have very, very small waste and recycling. You might be a standard office with 10 to 100 people who work in the office, and really you don't generate that much waste on site. But you might notice as a result that actually the big impacts are generated throughout your supply chain, and that becomes the focus area. Or for other businesses, you may be in the agriculture space, or you may be in the hospitality space, and you notice that you do have huge waste and recycling. You also have large amounts of water consumption. So the sustainability strategy that you set out and the environmental hotspots for your business are going to widely differ and depend on the industry that you're in. So it's really important that you have an understanding of where the needle is going to move based on the type of business that you are. and also a really good understanding of where you sit in comparison to your competitors or other similar businesses in the industry. So providing you with benchmarks is a big focus for us, and I'm sure for lots of other businesses out there, so that you know where you sit in comparison. From a social sustainability perspective, we want to be looking at how your people are, how your people are engaged with the programs that you have, how you're treating your people, of course, and the ability to educate them and include them, to make sure that they feel valued within your organization, and also the wider impacts that you have on your community as well. And NetNada, we can go through this with you and measure this for you. But this will be a much more qualitative process. It's of course less zeros and ones and more talking to your team and talking to the wider communities you work within. And then from a governance perspective, as I mentioned, this is not something that we ourselves help you out with, but it is something that we definitely encourage you to push on here. So I just see a bunch of notes in the chat, so I'm going to check if these are any questions about the current before I move on. But if you do have any questions, please jump in and let me know. Okay, awesome. Looks like Oscar's doing a good job there, organizing the chat. Fantastic. So when we're talking about our carbon accounting methodologies, it's very, very important to first things first, understand where the data is coming from. And this is one of the most, if not the most important things for a business, especially when they're starting out and gathering their information together. In our carbon accounting methods, there's two typical ways that businesses start to collate their data and understand where their impacts are generated. First is your spend-based approach. This is widely used around the world. Essentially, you're looking at every expense that occurs in your business. The reason you do this is because you want to see, of course, what you're spending your money on, who you're spending it with, so who are your suppliers and what's their sustainability credentials, what types of products or services you're getting off those individual suppliers, because as we know, many businesses provide lots of different products and services themselves. You also want to see your spend volumes and when you are spending, to see if there's any trends occurring over different periods of the year. And lastly, you want to see the account types or business units in which these expenditures are occurring in, so that you can compare different departments, different locations within the business, or different accounts coded for different activities that you may do. Once you've done the spend-based approach, it's really, really important to sort of take a step back and appreciate that this is not an exact science, right? Your spend-based approach, I'm not going to say is never going to be, but is certainly not at the moment a perfect, accurate method to analyzing a business's true emissions, environmental impacts, or even broader impacts. Now, the reason for this is not everything is best measured in dollars spent. Good examples of where dollars spent is not as useful as units of measurement include electricity bills. You may spend $1,000 on electricity. I might also spend $1,000 on electricity this month for our respective businesses. But you may be on a completely renewable plan with green power, and I may be on a mixed plan, or potentially even just a standard grey energy plan, right? So obviously, although we spent the same amount of money, there is a different emissions factor, and there is a different emission that has occurred for energy. The same goes for your waste and recycling. Of course, it's better to see units of measurement around tonnage and volumes for different streams or different types of waste and recycling materials. Same goes again for flights. You might spend $10,000 this month on flights, and I might as well, but you might fly business class to London, and I might do 20 economy flights return to Melbourne. So in these particular examples, and there's lots more examples within typical businesses, it's really, really important to make sure that you get the activity data where you're looking at, yes, what the financial data has told you, but you're also looking at the specific units of measurement. So it's all about combining that spend-based approach with the activity approach so that you can get more granular insights on your organization's activity and also the suppliers that you're working with. Now, the way I like to explain these carbon accounting methodologies is it's like a hierarchy, right? We're always building on the greater granularity we can get and the more information we can get on suppliers and also on your own consumption. So yes, initially you might do an analysis of your spend-based approach. You might look at all of the expenditure in your business and who it's been with. And there'll be some assumptions made because maybe some of your suppliers don't have very clear or any sustainability information. You will then go to the next step where you'll add in your activity data. You then might see that certain suppliers are responsible for a huge amount of your total emissions. So you might ask those suppliers specifically if they have any sustainability information that they can provide to you to get a more accurate reading of what their services were. And then above that, if possible, you'll go through and check and see, are any of my suppliers carbon neutral, or do any of my suppliers have what are called life cycle assessment analysis, or LCAs, on their particular products and services. And the reality is that the space we're at the moment from a global carbon accounting perspective is right now, as you are probably familiar with in your own business, not many businesses have that top level of data where they've gone through the process of having life cycle assessments done on what's referred to as the cradle to the grave impacts of their products and services. But what we firmly believe is in the coming years, you're going to start to see that become the norm. And I think, over the next decade, the level of transparency and data and ability for reporting and compliance from all businesses is going to really just fly through the roof to where we're currently at, which will mean ideally in a perfect carbon accounting world and in an environmental sustainability world as well, you'll have the ability to very, very clearly see exactly the impacts of every purchase that you've made. Additionally to this, all of the same data really comes through for environmental sustainability, especially when looking at supply chains, as does for your social impacts. So this will all be tied together with modern slavery assessments, diversity, equity, inclusion, and labor rights throughout your supply chains as well, so that you can really, really clearly know where those risks may lie from a sustainability perspective in your suppliers. So as I've briefly touched on there, the strengths and the weaknesses of our spend-based approach, you can obviously transfer huge amounts of data and look at huge volumes of activity through the spend-based approach. And this allows a complete coverage of your contractors and suppliers, or a complete coverage of your overall emissions. But however, that while it is a complete coverage, is not necessarily a very pinpoint accurate or granular coverage. There are often assumptions in the weaknesses in this approach, which means the approach is really only as good as the data that you have and the database that you're referring to for your conversion factors. So while it does represent a good assumption of what your emissions are, it does not always accurately represent exactly what your emissions are. I think the importance with accuracy is, of course, it's much easier to go to sleep at night when you know that your disclosures are as accurate as possible. But what accuracy also gives you is it makes it actionable, and it allows you to start to pull levers on your emissions and on your suppliers. Probably the most common question I get asked is, what's the solution that I can implement for my business? And the answer, unfortunately, is it's incredibly hard for us to know until we've actually looked at your business's data and identified where these hotspots sit. And so back to my point, accurate data is the key to actionable outcomes, because the more accuracy you have, the more changes you can make that are precise. Now, the activity-based analysis, it also has its strengths and weaknesses. It obviously is a slightly more labor-intensive process. At NetNada, we use OCRs, which are optical character recognition systems, which automate the reading of the bills. But of course, if you're a company like some of the businesses we work with that have hundreds of sites, and let's say you're getting electricity bills once a month, then that pretty quickly multiplies into 1,200 or so bills a year. And then that's just your electricity. You've got gas as well. You've got waste and recycling, flights. You've got your employee commuting. You've got all these different places where the data may come from. So while it is more accurate, it can be a more heavy process. Is probably the best way to put it. But we really believe that the combination of these two puts you in best practice to make sure that your emissions analysis is as accurate as possible. So the big change that we've seen over the last few years from a carbon accounting perspective is businesses are moving away from the manual spreadsheet process. Of course, if you're looking to analyze companies with hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue a year, and hopefully less expenditure than their revenue, but similar figures in the expenditure, it's just not possible for people to manually go through all of that data. So what we of course are seeing is a shift. AI, machine learning, is the great buzzword of 2023, and I'm sure it will continue to be so for 2024. And this is really unlocking the ability for everyone here in this call to, for the first time, to be able to have no limit on the scale of the analysis that is occurring. I think the exciting thing about this is it means that more people who are interested about sustainability can spend less time calculating up PDFs, JPEGs, invoices, manually inputting data into spreadsheets, and can spend more of their time actually implementing the strategies and the solutions that can help their businesses become more sustainable. I mean, we are facing one of the biggest challenges, and without a doubt, over the next decades, to drastically reduce emissions to align with the Paris Agreement's targets, to align with the science-based targets, 1.5 degree warming or 2 degree warming if we fail to hit 1.5 degrees. There are so many amazing people in the world who are sustainability subject matter experts, or very passionate, or planning to become both of the former there. But the more we can get them actioning outcomes and spending less time in spreadsheets and PDFs, the better. And so this is the process that we're seeing and what's occurring, the revolution, if you may, that's happening before our eyes. And for all of those reasons, the obvious thing is, yes, the outcomes, but it's also the compliance piece. The mandated reporting requirements is a huge risk realistically for businesses. And I think the best thing you can do getting an introduction into sustainability and more narrowly speaking, carbon accounting, or your environmental reporting, or even your social impact reporting, is, as I mentioned before, is to be transparent, and is to be making sure that you're reporting to the standards and frameworks that we've outlined above, because you don't want to get yourself caught in a position where you're reporting apples and oranges to, say, your biggest client. If your biggest client is, in theory, McDonald's, and McDonald's has reporting requirements to both the ISSB and in Australia under their mandated disclosures, if you're one of their big suppliers, they're going to ask you to report to them. And you need to make sure that what you're reporting to them aligns with what they need for their reporting standards. So what this sort of software angle allows us to do is to have a unified, standardized methodology approach where you make sure that you are compliant and it's not maybe an apples to oranges calculation that you're maybe making up yourself. So with that said, now we're going to jump into our carbon offsetting and understanding what our carbon liabilities are. This is an incredibly important part of any business who's looking to become carbon neutral, or who's even just looking to offset small parts of their emissions. The reason this is so important is because it's full of risk, and businesses, big and small, have been caught out by, ASIC recently, or globally speaking. There's been a lot of high-profile lawsuits, of companies as big as Delta Airways. Like, they are one of the biggest airlines in the world, and even they managed to get this wrong. So it's really, really important to understand what the potential threats and risks are associated with carbon offsetting, and how it can be done to the best standard and best way, so you make sure that you're supporting projects that deserve your support, essentially. So what are our carbon liabilities as a starting point? Well, your carbon liabilities is your CO2 emissions. If you've generated 100 tons of CO2 emissions across your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, they are your liabilities. Now, for the accountants in the room, or for the financial people in the room, or people who are just interested in the dollars and cents, typically speaking, in Australia, under the Australian Carbon Credits Unit, or the ACCUs, you're looking at anywhere between $30 to $60 a ton for a carbon offset. So if you have 100 tons of carbon liabilities or CO2 emissions, you are up for somewhere between $30 to $60 times 100 to offset yourself to carbon neutrality. Okay, pretty simple old case. Now, the reason that the ACCU has such a varied price is because at the end of the day, it's decided by the market. And this is what you need to understand as a consumer, is there are different projects that, yes, they all sequester or offset a 1 ton equivalent of CO2, but they all have different impacts on the communities that they work within. They all have different methods and ways that they create this creditable removal of emissions. And so if you're the business leader, or if you're the leader of your sustainability team, or if you're the person in charge at your company with engaging with your colleagues around the sustainability strategy, the type of offset project that you support has a lot of what are referred to as co-benefits. Now, the co-benefits are other ways that these projects help people, environment, and the communities that they operate in. So, for example, there are lots of great projects that support women in developing communities to have financial independence. There's lots of great projects that support children to have access to quality education. There's lots of great projects that are Indigenous led. So it's really important from an ethics perspective to understand what it is your organization wants to support, apart from just that carbon reduction and that offset that goes towards your carbon liabilities. Now, how you actually do this is something that businesses tend to struggle with. First things first, it can be very difficult to get access to quality offsets. So I would recommend thoroughly that no matter how you're going about it, you do your research on the projects that you're looking into. Once that's occurred, you need to either go through an organization who's a retailer of carbon offsets, or who has a financial license to work with wholesalers. So NetNada ourselves, we have a financial license. We work with wholesalers of specific carbon credit projects that we've vetted ourselves. So there's only 8 projects that we offer through our software. And because the reason is they're 8 projects that we've just had time at the moment to go and check out and do the analysis of, to make sure that they're actually doing what they're saying they're doing. Now, NetNada doesn't charge a fee or take a commission or anything like that on any offsets that are purchased through the platform, because at the end of the day, we are a carbon accounting and sustainability reporting and analysis software. So we think it's a bit of a conflict of interest, to be honest. If we're the ones telling you how big your footprint is, we don't think we should be in a position to be making any money off those offsets. But whether it's NetNada or not, you'll buy your offsets through either a retailer whose business model is to trade offsets and make their money that way, or you'll buy it through a third party who has both financial license and relationships with projects and wholesalers. Once you've purchased those offsets, you will retire them. So the retirement of offsets is when you're applying those offsets to offsetting the impact that's generated by whatever it is, whether it's your business, a particular product and service that you're trying to certify, or just some small parts of your activity. Canceling an offset is different, but very similar. Canceling an offset does not offset any of your emissions. The analogy we have here is it's like putting food in the bin without eating it. Now, you may be scratching your head and saying, why would someone want to put food in the bin without eating it, right? Well, it's a very good point. And what we're seeing is it's rare, but it happens more so in other markets that are capped markets and more deflationary asset classes, because it's a supply-demand push. So in the UK and the EU, they use a credit system called the EUA, where we use what's an ACCU. The EUA, they have a fixed demand every year. They know there are a certain amount of demand that will come from the top 1,500 largest companies in the UK and EU, who have to offset a percentage of their total scope 1 and 2 emissions and parts of their scope 3 emissions, right? So they know every year there's going to be X million tons of offsets that need to be purchased through the EUA scheme. What happens there then is, because you have that fixed demand and supply is capped at a certain number, it becomes, economics 101, basic supply demand push, right? Which means if I'm an individual and I want the big companies in Europe to be reducing their emissions more than just offsetting, then if I go in and buy 100,000 pounds or euros worth of offsets and cancel them, I'm doing a good thing for the world, because I'm not only supporting whatever projects there were and being responsible for those emissions, but I'm also now reducing the supply, obviously, of the EUAs, because I'm taking out of, say, the bucket of EUAs, where the demand is remaining the same, which obviously pushes the price up, which makes it more financially, unaffordable, or just makes it more unaffordable for these big companies to be offsetting from the EUA. Okay, so that's an example of where cancelling occurs. Cancelling doesn't occur in Australia because, well, it does. Some people do cancel, but it doesn't really change the supply-demand curve, because the way the ACCU is set up is it's not a capped system. So there is an inflationary effect on the total asset class. Now, with that in mind, we always recommend that you are looking to reduce rather than offset, okay? And the first step you should be taking in the process is reduction before offset every time. There are areas in your business, there are areas in your supply chain where you can make improvements. It's not only better for the environment and people that you make those reductions, it's also better for your business, all right? Back to my example before, if you have 100 tons of CO2 emissions, and that's going to cost you, let's call it in the middle, say it's going to cost you $50 a ton, right? That's going to cost you $5,000 to offset your business's total carbon liabilities and bring you to carbon neutral. If you can reduce that by 30%, right? You're not only creating a better outcome because it's less of a band-aid solution. You're actually removing those emissions before they occur, but you're also saving yourself, over $1,500 in the process. So we're really focused on always helping find solutions. Offsetting should be considered as the last step in the process for the residual emissions that currently can't budge. You might have a business that relies a lot on fleet and logistics, and right now for the type of logistics you're doing, you don't have access to EVs that are going to do the job properly. Offsettings go. Or you might be flying a lot and you've reduced your flights as much as possible to use Zoom more. But at the end of the day, your client needs you to go to site in Perth every month or whatever it may be. Offsetting is a solution there. Cool. So with that in mind, finally for today, the certification process and how different certifications can help different businesses. It's really important to remember as well, while carbon neutral certification is a fantastic certification to achieve, and it's definitely sort of the North Star for most businesses who are trying to improve their environmental sustainability, there are other certifications that may be more suited to you. And again, just like before, where I was saying there are sometimes residual emissions that you may not be able to reduce based on the type of business that you are and the operations you have. Sometimes carbon neutrality for certain businesses is just not suitable for them at this point in time, right? There might be financial restrictions, there might be inabilities to offset that much. And so it's important to remember, back to my first point, and I hope this is one of the key takeaways for you as an introduction to all of this, is that transparency is the best outcome, right? And so if you can be transparent and clear about your reporting and really understand why you've made certain decisions, often case it is better than you just deciding, we have to be carbon neutral. If you can be carbon neutral, of course, strive for that. It's fantastic. But as a takeaway from this, I hope people understand that carbon neutrality is not necessarily, the only way for you to be a sustainable business. But you should always be striving towards it. So with carbon neutral certifications, there's climate active carbon neutral, which is supported by the Australian government. It's a good certification standard. It has a lot of companies in Australia that are on it. Like most things, it has its shortfalls. Its methodology is good, but can definitely be improved in the scope 3 areas, and around how companies set different boundaries. It's important to remember as well, under climate active carbon neutral, there are carbon neutral organizations as one certification. There are carbon neutral products and services as another certification. There are carbon neutral events as another certification, carbon neutral buildings as another certification. So you may see that certification symbol and think, oh, the business I'm working with is climate active carbon neutral. That means everything that they give me, everything I buy off them is carbon neutral. Not necessarily the case. Okay. So if their organization is carbon neutral, but they sell, I don't know, microphones for the sake of the argument, that does not necessarily mean that the microphone that you've purchased off them is carbon neutral as well. Overseas, in the UK and the EU, we see the PAS 2060 certification a lot. This is a fantastic certification, to be honest. I think the amount of due diligence and the governance processes around this certification for carbon neutrality are fantastic. Other certifications that you'll see that are not carbon neutrality necessarily include things like B Corp. B Corp's a great certification. Certainly carries a lot of weight. Has a very, very strong process for how they analyze businesses. Neighbours ratings. I'm sure everyone here's seen Neighbours ratings. They're internationally recognised and look at energy waste, water, indoor environments, buildings and tenancies. So Neighbours ratings are fantastic as well. And then, of course, it becomes more of a compliance base and less so certifications, I think, but making sure that you're compliant with things like modern slavery for the bigger businesses or the government organizations that you work with. My last point would be on the certifications front, make sure that you're very conscious of each certification that you see and who the organization behind that certification is. Okay. It's very easy for people to just make up their own certifications. Okay. And as I mentioned before, with the apples to oranges comparisons, especially now that we're thinking of this whole space as more compliance than anything, just because someone has a certification that says they're carbon neutral, or a certification that says they have ticked all the boxes for modern slavery, or a certification that says that they are, a certain waste or recycling metric, doesn't necessarily mean that the methodology that's been followed behind that is very robust. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it means anything to governments or large enterprise who actually have, mandates and requirements. So I would very, very, very much encourage you all to, when you do see a certification that's provided by a client or someone you work with, or whoever it may be, just to check what that certification is and check where it's come from. And if there's no methodology that's publicly disclosed and transparent about how that certification occurred, then you should really be asking some questions about the legitimacy of that. Now, in review, I will be sending around a link to the below. I know that a lot of you have been sort of eating lunch or doing other tasks while I've been chatting away. So I hope you've been able to absorb as much as possible by osmosis, if you will. But I'll send around this session review, which is 10 questions, which just sees how you've retained the information from a quiz perspective. The reason I do this actually is because if you want to fill out the quiz, you definitely don't have to by any means, but if you want to fill out the quiz, you're then 4 modules into our 12 module course. And we provide you with a badge and a certification for completing our carbon accounting and intro to sustainability 101, which then we find is really helpful for businesses who are either using NetNada or advisors who are using NetNada with their clients, because that entire 12 module course runs you through how to talk about sustainability, how to implement sustainability in businesses, and then lastly, how to get those outcomes out of your sustainability and your carbon accounting. So if you do feel like filling out this quiz, go for gold. We'll see those answers come through, and we'll see how you go. And I'll know maybe where I need to focus a little bit more on explaining things. If you don't feel like filling out the quiz, no worries at all. I'm definitely not forcing anyone to do that. So to finish off, if you've got any questions, please let me know. If you do fill out that quiz, I'll send you the next modules, the following 8 modules that go along with this course. But yeah, thanks everyone for turning up. It's been fantastic to speak with you all. And yeah, I'm keen to hear if anyone has any questions. Alrighty, where's the chat? Good to hear, Tima. I'm glad that was helpful. How long roughly does getting carbon neutral certification take, and can small business do this? Very good question. So if you look at climate active carbon neutral, the typical time it takes businesses, on average, out of all the businesses who've had it done, is a bit over 4 months. With that said, that is very much, I guess the data is, I wouldn't call it skewed, but the data is considering the fact that most of the time it's been done until softwares were available, it was done by consultants. So obviously that is a more time consuming process. So with NetNada, we've helped businesses get it done in a month, and always well below 4 months. But yeah, the average time is about 4 months, but I would say about a month to 2 months is fair enough. Another question. Cool. I don't see any other questions. Oh, I've got one there from Simon. Thanks, Simon. What's good practice for recording flight data? Is there a software for this? Really good question. Most of the main airlines can provide you with CSV sheets of the flight data that that your business has used. Additionally, if you have a travel agent, they should be able to provide you with the same information. If it's in CSV, then you can upload it into systems like NetNada or whichever way you manage your data, and then that can tell you the impacts of all of your flights. It is important though with flight data to make sure you got to make sure that you've got the specifics about the flights on there, right? Like you want to see, was it a Airbus A380 or a Boeing 747? You know, was the flight business class or economy? What was the distance traveled in the flight, you know, say Sydney to London or whatever it may be. So making sure that you've got all the relevant data in that flight data is very important. But thanks for that question, Simon.